Yeah, thank you everyone for being here. It's a pleasure really to have Luke here. And Luke, for those of you who do not know, is an alumnus. Is one of the PhD students from UEA. I had 3 months of Bob, then the rest was Steve and Bruce. So it's basically one of these industrial economics product. Has been successful since then. He's senior lecturer in Loughborough, and in the field has done lots of work on cartels, something that done probably training from Steve. And overall, he's and he's an associate editor, and he has nice duties. And he's worked a lot also with former colleague Chris Wilson, from also a student from UEA, and they do lots of good theoretical work on industrial economics, and been really successful with good publications. So we're very, very lucky to have him here. His pleasure. Is also an external associate from CCP. So if you want, he's helping also the center to the job. And luckily, there are colleagues today of people that would have been here, like Morten, Catherine, Peter, and I can't remember who was the fourth one. So and for us, I might be online. So, okay, very nice. Looking forward for your talk, which is very interesting. And then it's usually you're gonna take questions.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Thanks, Luke. Yeah. And remember, it's hybrid, so there will also be people online.
Yeah.
And thanks.
Sure. Thanks very much. Thanks for the invite. Pleasure to be back. So the first thing to say is that this is joint work with my colleague Chris Wilson at Loughborough, our former PhD student Rocky Lee, and our former colleague Antonio Rio. In this paper, we're interested in understanding cost pass-through in markets where there's price dispersion. So cost pass-through has been a hot topic in recent years, mainly because it's a topic that's so fundamental to many areas of economics. The previous theoretical literature has made great strides in understanding the determinants of cost pass-through rates. And by that, I mean the extent to which prices rise following an increase in costs. And what this literature has shown is that the curvature of demand is a key determinant. There's a bit of a gap in our understanding because this literature focuses on what I'm going to call pure strategy settings, where firms set the same prices. In contrast to these settings, and in contrast to the law of one price, empirical evidence has shown that price dispersion is commonplace in many markets. So we don't know a lot about what determines pass-through in these markets with price dispersion, and indeed whether the shape of demand is important. So what do? We analyse cost pass-through in a generalised model of price dispersion that encompasses many of the models of price dispersion that have appeared in the literature over the past few decades. The source of price dispersion in this model comes from the fact that some consumers are captive to particular sellers, whereas others are not. So firms have to balance their incentives between setting high prices to their captive consumers to exploit them against setting low prices to attract the non-captives who shop around for better deals. So to study pass-through in this mixed strategy setting, we employ a novel approach that I'll talk you through in detail a little bit later. And what you're going to see there is that this approach links quite well to the existing pure strategy literature.
So that's the question. So this is in the context of the product here is homogeneous. We started.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So So yes, we're modelling these markets where there's differences in prices despite the fact that the products are seemingly homogeneous.
And the preferences will be otherwise the same of consumers, and the only thing that matters is that they can, if you want, loyal to a seller. Or that's the
exactly
the model.
Exactly. Yeah, so we can have heterogeneity in consumers for many of our results, but yeah. Okay. So following this approach, we're able to show that the curvature of demand in terms of whether demand is log-concave or log-convex affects these three things. So it affects the magnitude of pass-through rates, it affects how a cost rise affects price dispersion, and it also affects the impact on the prices paid by different consumers. For instance, when demand is log-concave, we find that pass-through is partial. So pass-through rates are less than 1, so the prices go up by less than the increase in the costs. In this case, when demand is log-concave, we also show that price dispersion decreases following a cost rise, and it is the non-captives whose prices go up the most. In contrast, when demand is log-convex, we get the opposite results. So we find that in that case, there is overshifting. So pass-through rates are greater than 1. So prices will go up by more than the increase in costs. In this case, price dispersion increases, and it is the captives who have a bit larger increase in their expected prices. So while these things depend upon the curvature of demand, what we also find is that the results on the impact on a consumer's surplus is slightly different and doesn't depend on the curvature of demand. I'll talk you through that in my next slide. So in addition to these key results, we do a whole host of other things, including showing how our results vary with the level of competition. And we also analyse the relationship between cost pass-through and demand shocks to demand, so shifts in the demand curve. I think in today's presentation, we're going to be focusing mainly on these things here. We're unlikely to have time to get into these things, but we'll see how we go. Okay. Okay, so our paper has a number of important policy implications regarding which types of consumers are most affected by cost changes. So this question links to the increased interest of policymakers in protecting vulnerable consumers, where vulnerable consumers are defined as those who are unable to engage in markets and therefore they tend to get a bad deal. Now, empirical evidence suggests that these sort of less engaged consumers are likely to be those that are less educated, poorer, and/or more elderly. Our model suggests that these types of consumers tend to face a smaller change to their surplus following a change in costs. So that's always the case when demand is log-concave, and it's the case for a lot of log-convex demand curves as well. So let's sort of understand what this means in particular. So what it means is that if costs rise, and it's telling us that a vulnerable consumer, a consumer that is less engaged in the market, is going to be harmed less than a more engaged consumer. So if we're worried about vulnerable consumers, or if we're interested in protecting vulnerable consumers, this is a good result, right? So they're getting harmed less. But the flip side of this is that if costs were to fall, it's the vulnerable consumers that benefit less, because their prices go down less than the prices of the consumers who are more engaged. So while I've sort of framed our results in terms of this, our results apply to all sorts of other applications, right? So,
is there an outside option as well? The consumers, are less likely to be in the market, they're vulnerable versus not. So here is everybody, it's a fully covered market.
Fully covered market. So let's think. So we have. So the consumers are ex ante homogeneous, right? So I'm going to say yes.
Behavior, yeah.
I'm going to say yes, but we have got the opportunity. We do cater for it a little bit, but yeah, consumers are ex ante homogeneous. Yeah. So the related literature. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this. All you need to know is regarding pass-through in markets with price dispersion, there's not much out there. So there is a small but growing literature, empirical literature, that our theoretical paper speaks to. And there is some limited theoretical research in this area as well, but I think it's fair to say that they don't come close to doing anything near what we do. So the wider literature on price dispersion. So this literature is vast. We have picked a model that encompasses many of the models that have appeared in this literature, and perhaps the most famous is the one by Varian in 1980 that sort of gave birth to this literature 45 years ago. Over the years, these frameworks have received ample empirical support, and they've been used to study wider applications, including price comparison platforms, online marketplaces, and also issues in finance and macroeconomics. So our results are going to be of interest to this whole literature. Let me just end the introduction by giving you a bit more details on the curvature of demand, which is the thing that the previous literature has shown to be important with regards to pass-through. What I've got up here is I've drawn 3 demand curves that vary in terms of their curvature. So I've got a basic linear demand curve that has a constant slope. I've got a concave demand curve where the slope gets flatter as the price goes up. And I've got a convex demand curve where the slope gets steeper as the price goes up. What the previous literature has shown is that pass-through is going to be higher for demand curves that look something like this, and it gets reduced as we move in this direction. So to understand this, let's think about the demand curves in terms of what they represent in terms of the willingness to pay. Right? So let's focus on this convex demand curve to begin with. What this is telling us is that there's a few consumers with very high willingness to pay, but lots of consumers with very low willingness to pay. And pass-through will be greater in these markets because as cost goes up, the firms can move away from targeting the low-value consumers towards targeting the high-value consumers. So this is what encourages the prices to increase a lot. In contrast, for a concave demand function, as cost goes up, there's nowhere for the firms to go, right? So they can't increase their prices as much. Okay. So throughout the seminar, I'm going to be talking about demand curves that are log-concave and log-convex. Okay, so they're slightly different, but A log-concave demand curve includes any demand curve that is concave. It includes linear demand, and also it includes some convex demand curves, provided they're not too different from the linear demand curve. A log-convex demand curve is a demand curve that looks like this, where the demand is very convex.
So what really matters is the elasticities, of course, for a quantity, they are opposite between the log-concave and the log-convex. So one is low, one is high.
What's
at the same point of the cube.
So it's not the elasticities, it's the curvature, and we'll come into seeing what the difference is between the elasticity and curvature in a minute. Okay. Okay, so how am I doing? Right. So the talk outline. So firstly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through the model. We're going to see the assumptions. I'll take you through the equilibrium. Then we'll go through the equilibrium cost pass-through. So I'll show you what our approach is to understanding pass-through, and then I'll show you what the determinants are. And then we'll go through our key results regarding the properties of pass-through. And then, like I said, we're probably not going to have time to get to this or further analysis. Okay. So let's go through the assumptions of the model. So while in the paper we analyse cost pass-through in a generalised model, price dispersion, in this presentation we're going to keep things simple for ourselves by focusing on the case where there are two types of consumers. I'm going to call one type of consumers shoppers, and these are going to be the ones that shop around for the best deal, and so they will buy at the lowest price. The other type of consumers are going to be captives, and they're going to buy from their captor firm. So we're going to have a proportion of sigma shoppers and a proportion 1 minus sigma of captives.
Just an intuition. Yeah. So here your captive basically are in a monopoly situation. The seller is in a monopoly situation, and it can absorb part of the past.
Yeah.
The other is in a more competitive situation. Yeah. So in a classic example of a normal demand, they're gonna be more exposed to the pass-through because there is no much absorption. Yeah. And that would be in a log-convex.
That's on the boat. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. You've given away the intuition already. Yeah. Oh, sorry. That's okay. That's exactly it. Yeah. So while in the presentation we're going to be focusing on this case where we've got two consumer types. In the paper we can have any number of consumer types, right? So we can have consumers that only consider buying from one firm, so they're the captives. But we can have consumers who consider buying from two firms, others that consider buying from three firms, and so on, all the way up to n firms. Okay. So I've done it this way to keep it simple for ourselves, but if you want to talk about this sort of the more general model, we can at the end. All you need to know is everything I'm going to show you here applies more generally. In a more general model. So we want to model demand as generally as we possibly can. So we assume that demand QP is downward sloping. So this has a couple of interpretations. So we can think of this as each consumer demanding more as the price falls. Alternatively, we can think of this as each consumer demanding a single unit at some willingness to pay, but this willingness to pay is unknown to firms, and so Q of P represents their probability of buying at the price P. We denote the price elasticity of demand as epsilon, and the measure of the curvature of demand, which is a thing that's been shown to be important in the literature, is given by this thing here.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, go for it.
You're making this as an assumption that demand is downward sloping. Is that necessary? I mean, is there ever even such a thing as upward sloping demand curve?
Is there an upward sloping demand curve? Yeah. So yeah, you teach that in. I used to teach that in first year micro. I'm trying to remember the name of it. They're called Giffen goods, aren't they? Where the demand is upward sloping. They're a special type of inferior good.
Okay, so you're just ruling out those special cases.
Exactly.
Okay, fine.
The important thing here is we haven't got a perfectly inelastic demand curve, which a lot of the price dispersion literature assumes. Right? So we're making demand more general. Okay.
But there's how many empirical models will be looking at this generality? Most of the empirical model will just go on the classic, either log demand or homogeneous good, or demand that are, of the classic, the one that's been studied so far. So
yeah.
One point is that the empirical literature that you will have might not be as general to capture this kind of demand that you have in mind.
Yeah.
Because it does assume a very generous functional form that the typical demand estimation will just not have.
Okay. So I think some of them do have downward sloping demand. So some of the papers in that sort of small but growing literature, they do have downward sloping demand, but they're theoretical sort of papers that lead into it. Have a fixed, perfectly inelastic demand. Okay, so throughout the paper, we make the standard assumption that demand is more elastic at higher prices. So this is sometimes referred to as Marshall's second law of demand, right? So if his first law of demand is that demand is downward sloping, this is his second law. And what this means is we can have any demand curve that is log-concave, and we can also have some demand curves that are log-convex, provided they are not too convex. Okay, so to give you three examples, we can have a linear demand curve where the curvature of demand here is 0. We can have exponential demand curve where the curvature of demand here is equal to 1. So that's the case where it's log linear. And we can also have the case of isoelastic demand where the curvature of demand is equal to this thing here, and the price elasticity is constant across the whole demand curve. So the isoelastic is a demand curve that is as convex as we can possibly get in terms of our assumptions. Regarding firms, we assume that there are n symmetric firms and that there's an equal share of captive consumers. Each firm incurs a constant marginal cost of C, and this means that the per consumer profits are given by this thing here. Assumption 1 guarantees the existence and uniqueness of a monopoly price that maximizes the per consumer profits. And it also has the important implication that these per consumer profits are increasing in price. So let me talk you through the equilibrium of this model. Since we're focusing on the 2 consumer type case, the equilibrium follows from Varian in 1980. This is a statement of the equilibrium, and since some of you might not be familiar with this model, what I'll do is I'll talk you through it. But before going through this, what I want to make clear is that there's no pure strategy equilibria in this model. And that's because if prices were above marginal cost, then the firms would undercut through standard Bertrand reasoning. But here, price equal to marginal cost is not an equilibrium because each firm will be able to deviate by charging a higher price and making positive profits from their captive consumers. So there's no pure strategy equilibrium here. But there is a unique symmetric mixed strategy equilibrium where firms randomize their prices according to this price distribution over this range. And this mixed strategy is characterized by this equation here. So what this is telling us is this left-hand side is saying that each firm can set a price equal to the monopoly level and obtain the monopoly profits from their captive consumers. The right-hand side is saying if the firm were to lower its price below the monopoly level, it would get the per consumer profits from its captive consumers plus the per consumer profits from the shoppers if it is the lowest price firm, which happens with this probability here. In the mixed strategy equilibrium, the firms have to be indifferent over these things, and so these two things have to be equal to each other.
What is the P with the underscore? Is just the lowest price?
Yeah, so this is going to be the lowest price. So this is the price that the firms will set, and they will sell to the shoppers with certainty. If they were to set a price below that, it'll be unprofitable. They'd rather just supply to their captives. Okay? Yeah. So by rearranging this equation, yeah, we find this price distribution, and indeed we can find this lower bound price. The upper bound price is the monopoly level. Okay. So since there's price dispersion in this market, the two types of consumers I will expect to pay different prices. So this term here gives us the expected price that captives expect to pay. And this thing here is the expected minimum price that shoppers expect to pay. A couple of measures of price dispersion that we're going to be interested in is firstly the captivity premium. So this is the difference between these two prices. So it's how much more captives expect to pay over shoppers. And this thing here is picking up the range of prices, the difference between the upper bound and the lower bound. Yeah.
So the slope of FOP depends, of course, on the demand. So the demand characterization is what determines what is your CDF shape.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, so let's notice something that's going to be important later on. And that is that this profit ratio here is the only thing within this price distribution that is a function of marginal cost and of price. So that's going to be important later on because this is going to determine our
marginal costs are constant.
Marginal costs are constant, yeah, that's right. So what we're going to see later on is how responsive this profit ratio is to marginal cost and to price determines the pass-through rate. Okay.
I think it would still be interesting to see the shape of FOP going back on the shape of your assumption of demand, be log-concave or log-convex, how it changes the shape.
Yeah, we might see that in a minute. Okay. So one thing, right? So here are the expected prices. We are interested in the pass-through rate of these, right? So we might think about differentiating these with respect to marginal cost. If we were to do that, notice that each of these terms has a number of terms that are a function of marginal cost, and they work in opposite directions, and sometimes they're not even comparable. So if you want to understand pass-through in these models, you're going to need a different approach. Let me talk you through, firstly, our approach, and then explain to you what the determinant of pass-through is. So to understand our approach, I'm going to show you what the a price distribution might look like. So we're going to assume that the price distribution looks like something like this to begin with. So we've got price on this axis here. This is the lower bound, this is the upper bound price, and the probability on that axis up there. Okay. So this is what happens before the cost rise. Let's suppose there's a cost rise and it shifts the distribution to look something like this. The sort of standard way people think about these price distributions is through what I'm going to call a vertical approach. Right? So they think about, for a given price, this point here represents the probability of a firm setting a price below this level. So the fact that this distribution is shifted to down here, what we can see is that the probability that the price is below this level is high before the cost rise, but is low after the cost rise. So that's indicating that the firms are sort of putting more probability on setting higher prices post-cost rise. But if you were to think about it in this way, think about cost pass-through in this way, you don't get very far. So we go the other way. So instead of a vertical approach, we think about it in terms of a horizontal approach. So what we think about is the extent to which the price rises, holding constant the probability. So this effectively derives a pass-through rate for every Z, every probability. There are two main advantages to this approach. First, this pass-through rate for every Z is going to be directly comparable to the monopoly pass-through rate, because that is given by the upper bound of this distribution. So that's going to mean that our results are going to be directly comparable to what we know about the monopoly pass-through rates. Also, what we show is that this pass-through rate is the main determinant of the pass-through rates of the expected price and the expected minimum price. And so they're going to be directly comparable as well to the monopoly price and the lower bound prices. Okay. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand the precise amount that the price distribution is going to shift to the right following an increase in costs. So to do that, what we do is we define P star as the price that sets the price distribution equal to 1 minus Z, and we derive the pass-through rate associated with P star through the implicit function theorem. And so it is given by this thing here, where L is this profit ratio that I was talking about earlier. That was the only term within the price distribution as a function of P and C. And so in words, what this is saying is that following an increase in marginal cost, the price rise required to keep the price distribution constant at 1 minus Z is determined by the relative responsiveness of this profit ratio with regards to C to P.
So just as a reminder, the consumers, once they're captive, they do not respond to a change in price on the search. So the increasing cost, for example, will make some of your captive consumers to start searching.
So in our main model, we have that exogenous at the end of the paper, and one of the things I'm probably not going to get time to talk about is we endogenize that, and we show that how our results change and how some of our results are robust. So, for instance, pass-through is higher in that case because what happens is following the cost rise, consumers search less. But our results on the distributional effects are still robust in that case.
Then they search less because of this, what we said earlier, the monopoly can absorb the other.
Exactly. So what we do is we can write this pass-through rate in terms of the underlying demand and cost parameters, and we get this thing here, where we show that at the upper bound of the distribution, this thing converges to the standard monopoly pass-through rates. We also show that our approach obtains simple pass-through rates for both of the expected prices. So this is the pass-through rate of the expected price that captives expect to pay, and this is the pass-through rate of the expected minimum that shoppers expect to pay. So notice that the main sort of determinant of these things is just sort of encompassed in this one pass-through rate, and so it's much easier to analyse than compared to what we would have got had we used those expressions that I talked you through earlier. Okay. Okay, so let me talk you through our main results. I'm going to talk you through 3 key results. The first 2 are related to the effects on prices, and the third one is going to be on the distributional effects. So the first key result, so we show that cost pass-through is higher when demand is log-convex than when demand is log-concave. And that follows because, consistent with the case of monopoly, the pass-through rate is greater than 1 when demand is log-convex, but it's less than 1 when demand is log-concave. This pass-through rate is equal to 1 across the whole distribution when demand is log-linear. So that's going to be the case for exponential demand. So let's go through some of the implications of this. So what this means is that when demand is strictly log-concave, the price distribution is going to shift to the right by less than the increase in costs. And since this applies across the whole distribution, we also know that the pass-through rates of the monopoly price, the 2 expected prices, and the lower bound are also going to be less than 1 as well. So this is why I could say that when demand is log-concave, pass-through is partial in that case. You get the opposite when demand is log-convex, right? So all those pass-through rates are greater than 1. So before talking you through the intuition of that, let me talk you through the second result on prices. And that is to do with results regarding price dispersion in the market. So here we're interested in how the price distribution shifts at different points of the price distribution. And this is going to allow us to say things about the range of prices and the captivity premium as well. So the effects on all of these things come from this one proposition here. And this says that as Z rises, so as we move towards the bottom of the price distribution, then this pass-through rate moves towards 1. So if demand is log-concave, it increases towards 1. But if demand is log-convex, it decreases towards 1. And here, for expositional purposes, we focus on the case of constant curvature, which is true for a large class of demand curves. But in an extension, we show that we don't need this, right? It just helps us sort of convey our results. We show that it's robust to having non-constant curvature. So what does this mean? Let's go through some more implications. So when demand is log-concave with constant curvature, it means that the price distribution is going to shift more, it's going to shift to the right more towards the bottom of the distribution. What's the intuition here? Well, roughly speaking, what's going on is that the top of the price distribution, the pass-through rate is closer to the monopoly pass-through rate because the upper bound price is the monopoly price. Towards the bottom, the pass-through rate is closer to 1 because the price is closer to marginal cost. So whether the price distribution shifts more at the bottom or the top boils down to whether the monopoly pass-through rate is greater or less than 1. And so since we know that the monopoly pass-through rate is less than 1 when demand is log-concave, it's telling us that the pass-through rate is going to shift more at the bottom when demand is log-concave. You get the opposite results when demand is log-convex.
So what role does sigma play here?
So again,
The proportion of captive versus non-captive consumers, they also will play a role here. They just make it, so if most consumers are captive,
yeah,
there is less room to gain from the non-captive.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that's.
Are you making an assumption the sigma has to be below a half or above?
No, so we can do the whole range. Yeah, so that's one of the things we look at when we sort of talk about changes in how competition affects this. So on the one hand, we can think about it in terms of the number of firms, but on the other hand, we can think about it as increasing the proportion of shoppers. Yeah.
The shoppers that are captive, or the
shoppers. So shoppers are the ones that shop around.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Captives, yeah. Yeah, I might be over here. I'm unlikely to get to that. We might be able to talk about that at lunch, but yeah. So what that means is this diagram that I showed you earlier, this is consistent with the case where demand is log-concave with constant curvature. Because the shift at the bottom of the distribution is more than at the top of the distribution. And notice that this tells us something about how it's going to affect the range of prices. Because the shift at the bottom is going to be greater than at the top, so that lower bound price is going to catch up with the higher upper bound price, and so the range of prices is going to get smaller after the cost rise. Okay. When you've got log-convex demand, you've got the opposite going on, right? So it's going to be shifting more at the top and less at the bottom, so you're going to get the opposite results. Okay.
So in the figure, what's the difference between C prime and C? It's a fixed amount, but
this is yes.
No, but how much is that compared to that the interval that you?
Yeah. So what that means is, since this is consistent with log-concave demand, the increase in C is going to be greater than that.
Yeah.
So it might be, over there.
Okay.
Yeah. Exactly. Okay. So what we've discovered is that when demand is log-concave, the range of prices is going to be strictly smaller following an increase in price, increase in cost. This also applies to the captivity premium as well. So what's going on here? What's going on here is the expected minimum price that is paid by shoppers is weighed more heavily by the bottom of the distribution than the expected price paid by captives. So that means that the expected minimum price, because the bottom of the distribution is shifting more, that pass-through rate of the expected minimum price is greater than the expected price, and so this gets smaller as well. Okay. Yeah, and like I say, when demand is log-convex, we get the opposite results for similar sort of reasons. Okay. Last key results. So this is on the distributional effects. So what we find here is that if demand is weakly log-concave with constant curvature, then an increase in marginal cost is going to strictly decrease the surplus of a captive to a smaller extent than the surplus of a shop. This result can also be true for log-convex demand, and indeed is always true for isoelastic demand, despite the fact that captives face a greater price rise. So let's understand what's going on here. So to understand what's going on, what we need to do is we need to realise that the impact on a consumer's surplus depends not only on the extent of the price rise, but also on the amount of units, or the number of units that they buy. And what we also know is that because captives are paying higher prices, they're going to buy fewer units than shoppers. So if the two consumer types were to expect the same price rise, then that tells us that the shoppers are going to be impacted more because they buy more units. And what we also know is that the price rises are going to be the same in the case of log linear demand, where the curvature of demand is equal to 1. Moreover, when demand is strictly log-concave, the captives, not only are they going to buy less than the shoppers, they're also going to expect a smaller price rise than the shoppers. And so that's certainly going to mean that their surplus is going to decrease by less. When demand is strictly convex, we've got two counteracting effects. So here, it is the captives who expect to face a higher price rise, but they buy less. So there's these sort of two counteracting effects. The impact on their surplus can be smaller if the quantity effect dominates this price effect. And we show that this is always true for isoelastic demand, which is a demand curve that is as convex as we can get given our assumptions. Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes left, so let me just whiz through all these extra things. So we consider the effects of greater competition, see how competition affects things. The conventional wisdom is that greater competition makes pass-through more cost-reflective, so it makes pass-through rates closer to 1. We show that increasing the proportion of shoppers is always consistent with this conventional wisdom, but increasing the number of firms is not always. What else we do? We think about how our results on cost pass-through relate to demand shocks, and this relates to this idea in the tax literature on whether there is an equivalence between a unit tax on firms or a unit tax on consumers. What we show is that in our setting, an increase in marginal cost is indeed equivalent to a unit parallel vertical decrease in demand. So we get this result in our mixed strategies setting as well. We think about endogenous consumer engagement that we've already talked about. So pass-through rates are higher when consumers choose how engaged they are, but our results on the distributional effects remains robust. We think about how our results relate to the case of ad valorem taxes. We show that many of our results apply in that case. And we also show that we don't need this assumption on non-constant curvature. It's just something that we use to make the exposition simpler. So concluding remarks. So we analyse pass-through in a generalised model of price dispersion. Despite the model having a mixed strategy equilibrium, we show that the curvature of demand is still important in determining pass-through. We employ this novel approach that links well to the existing pure strategy literature, and we show how the curvature of demand affects the magnitude, pass-through rates, how it affects price dispersion, and the prices paid by different consumer types. Finally, we show that the surplus of captives tends to change less than the surplus of shoppers when there's an increase in costs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So it's time for demand. I don't know if there are demands online. There are demands here from the audience. Is there any? So I have one demand. It's just a sort of setting here. We're looking at distributional effects, but basically those consumers they all have the same income. They have a different level of education, if you want, that makes them to become loyal versus non-loyal. This is the distributional part that we're looking at. Okay, so if consumers are real in a sense that they have, because it's more complicated, because the willingness to pay is dictated by what is the income response to a price increase. Yes, that's the income plays a role. Versus what is the willingness to pay that you have as a consumer for that product. Yeah. So it's two different, if you want, effects that they both contribute to these, if you want, price dispersion. Yeah. One is true. So here we're leaving one out by assumption because they say all consumers are the same, and the only thing that makes them they become to be of a type which is loyal versus the other would be maybe education is the one that separate the two. Yes, and the other thing that is also important, there is this is for a few number of products that are homogeneous in a way. So say water, for energy, we can have in mind homogeneous product because the price dispersion here. And the story will still hold if you include, a small degree of substitutability having two products, and because they become similar. I'd like to talk.
So on that point, we can think of consumers as having brand loyalty in our model, right? So captives might be loyal to a particular firm. And in the sort of more general model, their brand loyalty sort of varies across the market. So that's number one. Number two, regarding the differences in income, I think I'm right in saying that our results on prices will remain the same if we just sort of assume that the firms are not able to observe those differences and aren't able to price towards those differences.
They're not able to discriminate.
Exactly. So if the firm just believes that Q or P is the sort of demand of the representative consumer, then our results on the prices are going to go through. Yeah, but you're right. When you start introducing heterogeneity in terms of consumers, it's more difficult to work out their effects on their consumer surplus. That's indeed correct.
But we still wonder if you can make the claim about the distributional, effects if the firms don't observe. Suppose because there are two effects in place. One is the willingness to pay, and the other instead is the income effect. If you don't observe that, how can you infer there is being a distributional?
Exactly. So we can say things about the effects on prices, but we're less clear on the distributional effects. Yeah, sure.
Tanya Salim online has a question. If you could unmute yourself, please.
Yes, hi. Thanks for the really interesting presentation. I wanted to ask about the importance of the assumption that consumers can buy more, an individual consumer can buy more or less, because I guess then I wanted to understand, well, what are the implications and how do you deal with when that's not the case, and what are the industries that you think are therefore the most relevant for the analysis that you've created? So thinking of utilities or for example telecoms, broadband, consumers can't buy 2 broadband subscriptions, for example, but they can buy, for example, more apples in a supermarket.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So we've got these two interpretations going on. One is that consumers buy more as the price falls, for sure, and we think that applies to various sort of important markets like petrol, electricity, gas, and it can also apply to various sort of financial products as well. But the second interpretation is that the consumers have, they want to buy a single unit, but their willingness to pay is unknown to firms, and so that demand curve is sort of picking up the probability that the consumer is going to buy at a given price. So there, that can pick up those markets where they just want to buy one unit.
Thank you.
Okay.
We have Farasat Bukhari online who's got a question.
Yeah.
So Luke, I've seen this type of work a little in other places as well, where people are talking about, the curvature of these demand curves in relation to cost pass-throughs. What I keep getting stuck on is I do more empirical work, and in my line of work, we don't really look at these, type of demand functions. Often enough in empirical work, we have some version of logit style demand curve, whether it be nested logit or whether it be multivariate logit. And I've never really been able to figure out what does the curvature that you guys talk about over here have to do with cost pass-through over there, because there we have a very different way of evaluating how the cost through is, how much the cost through will be. And you model it, you put it in the equilibrium model, and you see the predictions coming out of it, whether it's in the tax form that you put in or some other cost shock that comes in. How does it relate to this empirical work? Maybe that's not a fair question, but I'm just trying to wrap my...
Differentiated products, the literature.
Yeah. So two things. So I do know there's a couple of papers out there that look to identify pass-through rates and how it links to the curvature of demand. So there is, I know there is evidence that for the result that when demand is log-concave, pass-through is less than 1, and indeed when demand is log-convex, pass-through is greater than 1. So that's number one. Number two, so I think I'm right in saying that in the sort of current pure strategy pass-through literature, the curvature of demand is important in those settings, and I believe that those models are general enough to encompass some of the cases that you mentioned. So it is going to be closely related, but it's not clear to me how. What I do know is that in our case, the curvature of demand becomes important through the change to the price elasticity. So this assumption 1 here, this is saying as we increase price a little bit, what happens to the price elasticity? What you'll see there is that the important thing is this curvature of demand. So this curvature of demand is going to affect how the price elasticity changes with price. I don't know if that helps you out at all.
Well, in the model that he has in mind, the sign will be always probably in this one direction. You might not be that from positive to negative because it's assuming very specific demand function.
No, so I mean, just to add to that, I mean, I'm not thinking of one specific one. I'm saying that, well, in some way you could call it one specific one, but I'm saying in empirical world, typically we tend to use one of these discrete choice demand models often enough, and they're some form of logit, some variant of logit, and there this concept of pass-through is handled in a very different way. We look at it by what the elasticities were and giving a shock there and figuring it out. So I still do not know how to relate that empirical work in a direct way, other than through some general discussion of curvature to the type of stuff that comes out in theoretical work in general, like the type that you're doing. I see a disconnect between these two type of pieces of work.
So I can send you the couple of papers that sort of try to connect these two things.
Also, Moraga has done work. Janssen and Moraga have done work on the estimation as well.
Yeah,
different models. Okay. Any more questions? Or I think,
I mean, it's slightly outside the scope, but I was thinking about this prospect of entry
Okay.
In this case, so yeah, the price for captive consumer can increase higher than the monetary price. Can trigger entry. So it's a bit different than normal case.
It's going to be different.
Because entering your model is you become like another firm which is incumbent. The entry you might have in mind, the entry which is competing for the shopper basically, and then you intensify competition there.
So you're right. So we in our model we've got the number of firms is fixed and exogenous. We do consider how that changes, and it would be possible to endogenize that. Have a free entry model and see how things changes.
The enter would be an unbranded would be the enter, for example. So you would not be having any loyal customers. You would only have to be competing if you want with the non-loyal, because you need to establish reputation for your case. So that's another way.
So it all depends on the assumptions, So exactly. So it all depends upon how it affects consumer engagement. That's what it boils down to. Yeah. Good.
Okay. Thank you so much. I think this is very good.